Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Lee and I'm currently a student at Georgia Tech. This is a presentation for CS 6460 and I plan on presenting a lesson guide based on cognitive learning styles. So the primary goal of this presentation is to go over this consolidated document of different learning styles. What I did as part of my content track was look at different cognitive styles that researchers have identified and tried to consolidate a lot of the information for educators so that they can make sure that their teaching lessons apply to all students of all learning types. Research has actually shown that if students are given difficult concepts through different representations, they actually have a higher understanding of the meaning behind lessons plans, and it'll actually help with knowledge transfer. So that's the current goal of this presentation. And the main categorizations of learning styles that I've done are basically sensory models. I'll go over a few of those, some cognitive processing models, personality models, and once we go through a few of the learning styles that I researched, I'm going to talk about a consolidated learning framework that's pretty much new. This is based off of very new research done in the 2014s where researchers went through and combed a lot of learning styles and basically built a framework for educators that they can apply to basically have the better effective teaching. So the first group of cognitive styles that I'm going to go through are the sensory models, and two of the models that I'm going to go over are the VAC model, and this is the visual audio kinesthetic model. And then I'm going to go also talk about the done and done model and focus on the environmental elements of that model. So the VAC model is actually one of the oldest cognitive style models and one of the most popular. Whenever you think of learning styles, this is actually the first thing that comes to mind for most people. I'm sure many people have heard this myth before, where people are definitely broken down into auditory learners, visual learners, and or kinesthetic learners. And it's basically one of the most popular models out there. So what does it mean? It means how do people want to absorb their information? This model predicts that people have a preference and although lots of people can learn from three different modes, an individual might have a preference for a certain style depending on what type of learner they are. So for auditory learners, an auditory dominant learner prefers to be actually listening to the knowledge content of what's being presented, and they are best suited for lectures, narrations, and discussions. Visual learners actually come in two parts, linguistic and spatial. The learners are visual linguistic if they like to learn through written language, such as reading a lot of books, articles, and actually writing tasks down. And visual spatial learners are those who are better at looking at charts, demos, videos, and other visual materials. Kinesthetic learners actually do best while touching and moving around. Basically, a lot of sensory, tactile learners. Uh, they're better with manipulating objects with their hands or building models, like actual physical models, and doodling, drawing pictures and diagrams, and that's basically the best way kinesthetic learners learn. They basically learn by doing. So now that we went over our first model, I want to go through and give a checklist for instructors so that they can basically evaluate whether or not their lesson plan is good for all different types of learners. Now I'm not going to go through every line item on this checklist, but I do want to let you know that I developed a checklist so that lesson plans uh, are well suited for different categorizations that are identified from the previous model. So obviously, as a high-level auditory learners, you'd want to record lesson plans, record audio transcripts of lectures, make sure that during learning sessions during classes that students can be engaged in auditory activities such as brainstorming, debates, having group discussions, and also allowing people to have time to debrief on activities and reflect on their lesson plans. For visual learners, it's really important to have graphs, charts, slideshows, illustrations, and other visual aids so that visual learners can basically quickly learn and grasp visual concepts. For the literary types, it's very important to include outlines, concept maps, and agendas. And another thing that's interesting about visual learners is when you give out handouts, always leave white space, because if they're linguistic, they're going to want to take notes, because the visual linguistic is very tied to words and linguistics. For kinesthetics learners, make sure that you have activities that get them up and moving. Kinesthetic learners are, again, they love building models with their hands. They love actually feeling tactile sensations. So it might be interesting to have projects where they can build a model, draw, or create other artifacts, and if possible, arrange field trips to locations that help facilitate learning, because this will actually help almost every type of learner, whether they're auditory, visual, or kinesthetic. So the done and done model is actually a very comprehensive model. I'm putting it into the sensory because it has the environmental and the VAC model actually built into it. As you can see within the psychological elements, it actually embeds the VAC model into this overall learning style model. And the reason why it's in the sensory part right now is because of the environmental effects, and I'm going to talk about that right now. So what this model did is they looked at the VAC model and they said, what can educators control in the environment so that all these different types of learners are basically in their optimal state. So the done and done model actually want to control stimuli for the students. So for auditory, ensure that you manage the noise and distraction from outside of the classroom, control the auditory input from students, stop the gossip discussions, make sure kids raise their hands so there's a single point of concentration. Now in this day and age, all cell phones should be turned off because any noise can help break the concentration of students. For visual learners, ensure that proper lighting is available to all students so that everyone can actually see the material. Close any windows if there are so that there are no distractions from the outside the classroom. Visual students can be very distracted. Minimize visual distractions for students within the classroom so there's a single point of concentration. And what the model means by that is don't have any distracting posters on the walls, and make sure that everyone knows where they should be looking at when you're actually giving a lesson plan. For kinesthetic folks, make sure that the temperature of the classroom is comfortable. Don't let it be too hot or too cold. I think this actually affects a lot of people, but for kinesthetic learners, it might be very detrimental if it's on the extreme. And ensure that the seating is arranged for everyone so that they can hear and see visually the seating material. So this is also very important. Now that we went through the environment grouping, the sensory grouping, the next class of learning models that I want to go into is the cognitive processing models. And this is pretty interesting because these models basically show how different people process information very differently than others. So there are a couple dichotomies that are interesting that we're going to be looking into. And in the first dichotomy is the analytic versus holistic type of thinkers, sequential versus random thinkers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the field dependence and field independence. So the analytic versus holistic thinking dichotomy is actually very prevalent across many different learning styles. It's actually, once again, a part of the old done and done model as well. And not only there, it's part of the cognitive style assessment model, the Gregoric model, the HBDI model, and to a lesser extent the field independence and field dependence model as well. So what is analytic versus holistic thinking? This dichotomy is, how do people look at information? Are they more breadth first search, or are they more depth first? Again, this dichotomy is labeled differently across models. Some call it analytical versus holistic. Some people call it singular versus holistic, or global versus analytical. And it basically boils down to, how is information processed? As CS majors, we pretty much know, depth first search versus breadth first search, and this is almost a different type of thinking or data collection that different individuals take. So analytic thinkers, specific thinkers, left brain dominance are more depth first approach. They're detail oriented. They prefer the structured environment. Global, holistic, right brain dominance, these are all the same, different words with the same meaning. They're context minded. They prefer free-form environments, and they're less detail oriented, but they're able to make more relationships between concepts. They're a big picture kind of thinker. One interesting experiment that determines analytical versus global thinkers is, when asked to take a photo of the subject, analytical thinkers often took a close-up picture of the subject, as seen in this picture on the left, because they're so focused on that individual. They're good at categorizing, and they do a close-up of the person. Holistic thinkers actually tended to take a picture of the person in their surrounding, because they aren't as laser focused on the subject. They want to see the subject as a whole, and how they are in relationship to their environment. So the concept of field dependence and independence is very, very closely related to the holistic versus analytical, but there is a very, very minute discrepancy, and basically what it boils down to is, once given information, how are they going to prioritize looking at the information? Field dependence means that they're actually very dependent on the whole field of information. So on the bottom right, you can see that maybe the brain, as it's processing information, it doesn't quickly categorize. It just looks at the field as a whole, and then you can see that in a gaze that they're going to be looking across the spectrum of the field. Field independence means that their gaze is usually very fixed, very categorized, very analytical, and they do, again, once the depth first again. So when you're in a field independent gaze, observers are actually very concentrated on where they look and how they're concentrating their thoughts. In this example, on the bottom right, they show that an independent person might be solely very focused on the person's face. Once again, it goes hand in hand with the picture. So if they were looking at this picture first, they would notice the guy in the front because they're in the front of the field. Not only that, they would dive into this categorization. They would see the eyes, the facial structure, the nose, and the mouth. So they focus on what's front and center, and then they dive in. Field dependent, it doesn't matter the depth or orientation of the people. They look at everyone. They look at all subjects, all categorizations across the field. For field-dependent learners, it's hard to discern categories, and they work better in larger groups. Field-independent thinkers categorize very quickly so that they can focus, and they work better in smaller groups. Another type of processing, cognitive processing dichotomy, is sequential versus random. And again, this is discussed across so many different learning styles. And again, it's called a different pairing in very different learning styles. Sometimes it's called sequential versus random, and I'm using the Gregoric since this is the oldest instance of this dichotomy, but newer models refer to it as horizontal versus vertical thinking, or breadth versus depth search. So for sequential, they need to process information in order and in a logical order. The ordering definitely matters. These kinds of thinkers prefer following directions. They need to be told exactly what they need to know and in what order they need to process the information. Random thinkers, horizontal thinkers, right brain dominance thinkers, they take a breadth first approach, and they actually love to absorb the information in any random order, as long as they can see the links between what they are learning. They prefer to be independent and creative. They like to take control and kind of figure out and build their own models in their heads. So it's interesting because these kinds of thinkers actually don't like to follow models. They like to build their own, and thus they don't like to build orders, follow orders. They would much rather do experimentation and figure bits and pieces of the whole rather than take a very streamlined and guided approach. So for the checklist for this dichotomy, I'm going to go into the analytical. You need to provide learning goals. Analytical learners need to be very methodical in their learning. You need to break down the lesson plan into very simple, easy to digest learning elements so that learners know how to focus, because it's all about focus. They need very structured tasks, clearly defined learning achievements, and because they're going to be the ones delving into it. You can't have unstructured environments because, again, it's very hard for analytical people to focus and concentrate where their deep thoughts should go. Again, and information should be provided so that they can drill down to a very granular level. Holistic thinkers prefer big concepts of the lesson plans. So from the lesson plan breakdown, show how the concepts are interconnected and related to each other. That's way more important for holistic thinkers. They need to know the purpose, the bigger picture, and the motivations for why they need to learn, and they also are much more interested in the relationships between concepts. Because holistic thinkers are not really good at categorization, it's good to provide higher level summaries so that you can aggregate information for them. For sequential versus random thinkers, you should definitely give students a choice on whether they want the clearly defined structured environment or whether they want a more loosely defined creative experimental projects, because you want your students to be a little bit more motivated depending on how they process information. Give the students a choice of whether or not they want to work alone or with a big team, because this is also very very important. You don't want two people that have different cognitive processing styles and they're just going to be not in sync with how they go about learning the material. So it's also very important for team formulation. So now I did briefly talk about motivations, and one thing that's interesting is now we're going to go into the personality uh, part of the learning styles. Uh, and there are a lot of different stable personality based cognitive styles or learning styles, and the most famous, it seems like, is the Myers-Briggs dichotomies, and I'm gonna go over them, but keep in mind that it's not particularly suited for learning, but it is interesting because it does fall under the category of cognitive styles. So the Myers-Briggs dichotomies are the introverted, extroverted nature of the individual, observant or intuition, thinking and feeling, judging and perceiving. Now, what do I mean by it's the most popular? It's widely accepted that people that do have a stable personality often do fall under one of these categories. Again, people come in all different shapes and form, sizes, different personalities, so maybe they might not be directly defined by one of these categories, but more often than not, 80% of the individuals will clearly associate themselves with one of the 16 personalities that are defined by the combinations of the previous dichotomies. Um, So based on stable personality types, you can see different motivations, and motivations drive learning for individuals. So I'm going to we can look into the different dichotomies, and then later we can have a checklist based on how instructors can maintain motivation for students. The first dichotomy, I'm going to do a subcategorization of energy. How are personalities drawing their energy? Are they getting it from other people? Do they want to make an impact on other people? Are they putting others first? That's extraversion. They tend to be very community focused. They tend to be very mindful of people. Again, this is kind of goes hand in hand with it's kind of indirectly related to the field kind of thinking. And basically, extroversion is very people focused. Introversion is very introspective. They draw them energy from themselves. They tend to be a little bit solitary. They are good at listening, and also they prefer to work alone often. So the sensing and intuition part, this is pretty interesting because again, it kind of goes into sequential versus random thinking. Sensing is very structured. They are in the here and now. They're very practical, and they tend to focus on very detail orientated, very related to very in tune with their senses, the here and now, and less for the abstract notions. So a good example of a sensing type of person is they're more realists, they're down to earth, and if how they view the world is just exactly how they see it. There's no hidden meanings. They're very upfront and direct. Intuitive types are more on the abstract. They're free-forming. They love philosophical questions. They might not be practical, but they do love having the ideas. They like focusing on the ideas, the abstract concepts, relationships again, information. They're not necessarily sequential. They just are very caught up with the ideas and the ideals behind them. The third dichotomy in Myers-Briggs is decision making, and it's pretty interesting because it's the age-old personality type of are you a logical person or are you more of an emotional person? I think this is kind of important for learning because you want to appeal to both types of people, and it's basically boils down to how you want to motivate someone. Again, is it a ethos argument or a logical logos argument on how you want to motivate kids? Obviously, the thinking, they're more black and white, they're true or false, they're structured, they're very logical. Feeling, they have to want to do what they tasks, they have to be in it, their heart needs to be in it, they're passionate. They are very gray areaed, very gray areaed in decision making, and decisions are not necessarily logical, but they're made with the heart. Next is the lifestyle economy, and basically it's more work ethic, not work ethic, but how they perform tasks at hand. Judging people are way more structured. They like knowing exactly what to do. They like planning. They like minimizing risk. And so once they see a task and once it's very structured, they know exactly what they need to do. They're very routine based and structured, so they know exactly what to do and they go straight towards their goal. Perceiving, they're a lot more free-formed. They enjoy taking risks. They don't really focus on the goal. They focus on the current path, and they can get very distracted, which is good and bad. Again, they love freeform, and they like to be very dynamic and very responsive to their environment. So for the personality-based model of the Myers-Briggs, it's mainly motivation, I think, for students, and teachers need to be aware of how they're going to be motivating the students. So in terms of energy, you should give students the choice on whether or not they want to work in groups or by themselves, and that's derived from the extroversion or introversion. For information, for motivations, give practical reasons on why the lesson plan is important for the sensing types. For intuition types, like give principles and philosophical ideas behind lesson plans, open up the possibilities for these kinds of thinkers. For decision making, it's important not to mix maybe emotional and logical people into into teams because they have different goals for projects. So you want to minimize conflict as much as you can because you want people to focus on the learning material and not in disagreements or human conflicts. In lifestyle, give students the choice of whether or not they want to follow a structured, clearly defined project, or whether or not they would want a much more looser, creative, experimental-based project. Again, there's a lot of different learning styles out there, cognitive styles out there. I only focus on a few of the more important ones that I saw that were pervasive across learning models. And now I want to talk about a consolidated learning framework that I stumbled upon that's awesome. And this is a learning model that kind of builds on top of everything that I've been mentioning right now. And it's called Hades Learning Strategies Framework. And it's basically a model of learning that incorporates everything that we talked about. From a high level, it breaks down learning into 3 big inputs: the skill, the will, and the thrill. And again, this ties in motivation, skills, and different types of thinkings. So for skills, they basically go into alternative information gathering from broad to narrow, and it's great because it hits both the holistic thinking as well as the analytical thinking. It basically alternates so that they can go into surface consolidation and deep acquiring. That's the main two over here. Knowing success. The knowing success is basically very good for analytical. It basically breaks down the lesson plan and knows what to do. Helps learners know what they need to learn. And then the consolidation is basically learning strategies that help all different types of learners actually absorb all the information that they're getting. So the will is a little interesting because it very focuses on the motivations of the individual. How do you make sure that they're in the right state of mind for learning? And what it means is how do you make sure that they are competent? That's the self-efficacy part. How do teachers reduce anxiety for students? Because if students are anxious, they're not in prime learning conditions. How do you expand the mindfulness of students? And how do you change attitudes for students towards the learning content? The will is basically helping instructors realize that they need to make sure that the motivation is there. Within this learning framework, you'll see that the thrill motivation is also very important. How do you make sure that it's practical? How do you focus on the goals? How do you really obtain that deep motivation? And how do you make sure that the learning lessons stick with the students for a lifetime, pretty much? And you'll notice that it's within this learning framework, it's actually incorporating a lot of other models that I just talked about. So for example, managing the environment, you're going to see concepts that are that I just talked about in the sensory part. So for example, environmental structuring. How do you make sure the classroom is arranged properly, the temperature, the lighting, and even the seating charts? How do you make sure that that's optimal? Time management. How do you make sure that students are getting the right exercise so their minds are clear? How can you track the time of day to study? Because sometimes some students are much more active during certain parts of the day than others. How do you make sure that students are getting enough sleep so that they're primed, and how do you make sure that just auditorily that there are no distractions. The knowing success criteria is basically a guide to help instructors define what is the learning success. How do you define the goal? And this is addressing the part where learning should be structured. You should break down the learning goals from high-level concepts into smaller level concepts, and that's basically what the success criteria is over here. Now it comes the part where you're actually having students go into the learning, and it's very interesting because it suggests alternating between acquiring and consolidating. And not only that, you're acquiring surface learning, which is the breadth first, and then consolidating the breadth first learning. So you want to get the big picture of what you want to learn, and then you go into deep learning. And and then within the deep learning you go into acquiring and consolidating. So it's a really nice framework because it kind of combines the holistic and analytical, and not only that, it tells you how to go about acquiring the research and consolidating it. So within the holistic, there's another holistic part, and then with and another analytical part. So for acquiring surface learning, you might use mnemonics, summarization, record keeping, organizing, note taking, and then once you have all of that, how do you consolidate all the surface level learning? You can practice, you can help rehearse and do memorization, you can give feedback, you can basically look at how much time you spend on tasks, you can basically test teaching whatever you learned. And then once you kind of consolidated high level what you want to focus on for your learning, for each part you can go into the deep learning phase. And then how do you acquire deep learning? You go into more metacognitive strategies, self-regulation, and this is much more out of scope of this presentation, but that can be a research content in and of itself, the metacognitive strategies. And then in terms of consolidating deep learning, it's a lot of discussion, a lot more critical thinking, a lot of synthesizing the information that you've gathered. And that pretty much sums up the content track of this presentation. I went through, although in my research I did go through a lot of learning styles, I just did pick apart more of the pervasive dichotomies across learning styles, categorized them a little bit, and presented them to you, and then I presented a checklist so that instructors can make sure that they've effectively created great lesson plans so that they engage all types of learners. And then I went through a learning style strategy framework so that how you present the material is conducive and the most effective it can be for teaching students. And if you have any other questions, please feel to email me. But thank you everyone for a great class. It's been fun.